All right, I'm back, and we're going to talk about how we study human sexuality. So, it's really easy to think we know about lots of psychological topics just because we know a lot of people and they've said this or that. And so we get an idea that, well, I understand how people are. That's not how science works. We don't just sort of look around and make assumptions based on what people are doing or something like that. We need to think critically about what it appears people are doing or what it appears people value versus the reality of what they're really doing or the reality of what they really value. We want to make sure to eliminate disinformation as much as possible, right? We want to use science to clarify things. One of the things that's been really helpful about studying human sexuality from a scientific perspective is that we've really alleviated a lot of sex guilt and shame and things from people whose behaviors were not as atypical as they thought they were, right? So the more that we can sort of relieve people of myths, the better off we are. Now, it's really super important that we not substitute myths with like a scientist's personal bias. I mentioned earlier in an earlier lecture that it's really important that I'm not teaching you my philosophy on human sexuality, but that I'm just teaching you what science has revealed about human sexuality. Of course, in my lectures, I'm going to be just talking about certain aspects of it, and the textbook goes into more depth on lots more things having to do with the topics we're covering. But I wanted to give you sort of enough in my lectures that you could competently understand certain concepts in human sexuality. And so one of the things I really would strongly love for you guys to understand is how we study human sexuality so that maybe you could refute some of the statements that people make about especially psychological research, but research on human sexuality, right? There's a lot of misunderstandings about how we do the science. Whether we let bias guide us, things like that. So I think I kind of have underscored why we need to know how the research was conducted. So let's talk about some of the basic issues, some of the basic goals of studying human sexuality. So one big basic issue is who will be the respondents. You could call them participants. We have different terms for them. Sometimes in old research, we call them subjects. It's really important that we recruit respondents or participants who represent the population that we're going to try and generalize to. I tried to find a nice picture of people who look kind of, similar to each other, and mostly what caught my eyes, they're all wearing white t-shirts, so I don't know if that's really making them that similar. But if this was our subject sample, we maybe could only generalize our results to other people who wear white t-shirts. Right? We don't know that other people who wear the different colors of shirts would actually respond the same way. We have to make sure that our sample, whoever we're actually studying, represents the population that we're going to try and make assertions about, right? So if I'm going to try and say that the average American adult thinks this or that or acts in this or that way, probably the people in the picture who appear to be college students are not going to be that generalizable to, the average American adult, right? I mean, these are college students tend to be between, 16 and 24 on average. And whereas the average American adult, I think the average age for American adults is like 30 something, or I probably should look this up before off the top of my head said it. So right off age, they're probably on average younger than the average adult in America. They're probably on average better educated because the average American adult has not been to college, let alone completed it. And at least these students are in college in the picture. On average, people display their greatest openness to experience during college. And that as we age, we tend to score lower and lower on that trait. So these college students would be at their highest level of openness to experience, whereas the average American adult would be somewhere lower on that. I'm just off the top of my head thinking of just really easy ways that college students differ from the average American adult. And as a result of these differences and more that I didn't name, this sample that's depicted in this image are probably not going to be very general. The results from studies of these people would probably not be that generalizable to the average American adult. So what can we do? Well, one thing we could do is say, well, I'm just going to try and generalize to college students because that's all I have available to me as college students. I do a lot of research like that where I use college students as my sample and I just make assertions about college students. That's it. That's all I can say, right? That's all I can generalize to. The other alternative is to deliberately recruit people who are different, right? Like who they are the population that we want. So if I want to make assertions about the average American adult, I better recruit the average American adult, right? I can't just say, well, I'm going to recruit whatever's easiest for me. I need to get a sample that generalizes to the population that I'm trying to describe. So that's a really big issue. And some topics are hard to recruit the average, non-college student into. Like, for example, questions about human sexuality, right? It might be easier to study things having to do with pregnancy or menstruation or something because those are sort of medical questions and people are willing to reveal the answers at their doctor's office. And maybe if you worked with a doctor, you could get a sample of their patients or, right, you can imagine how that might be doable. But if you wanted to study something like rates of extramarital affairs, or you wanted to assess the rates of, attraction to children or something really objectionable, it's going to be a lot more difficult to get people to answer those questions, right? Those are difficult. People have high, strong motivations to lie about those things. And so it's going to be hard to recruit a sample of people who have those traits. So one function of that is that we tend to study the things that are studyable, right? So we have a lot of research on menstrual cycles and testosterone levels and issues having to do with childbirth. We have a lot of research on those things because those are, and we extend them out to the general population because those are things that we have information about. Where it's a little trickier is on the psychological components that pertain to human sexuality, because it's a lot harder to recruit people who aren't college students to participate in these studies. And so I want you guys to be a little bit aware of that. Now, the great news for you is that you are college students, so this stuff should generalize to you, so it should be fine. But for other people, they might say this psychological research, like, what's it doing for me? It's not describing me. And they have a valid complaint if we're only studying college students. So generalizability is one of our big issues. We want to make sure our samples generalize to our population. The other main issue is volunteer bias. So if we want to recruit participants for a study, we're not allowed to just sort of make people participate in our research, right? That the Geneva Conventions following World War II said we are not allowed to just sort of make people participate. And actually we had to nail that down even more in the late 60s when it was discovered that people were doing this was not psychologists, biological research on people who were in mental institutions and things like that without their consent. So prisoners used to be compelled to participate in research and things like that. Now, you can't do that. You're not allowed to compel anyone to participate in research. So now we are completely dependent on volunteers. And obviously you can see the benefits of that because you don't want to be forcing people to participate in research. But the downside of the volunteer only approach is that there might be something substantially different about those people who are willing to participate, who are willing to volunteer, that makes their results different than if everybody had participated. So I'll give you an example, and we're going to get to methodologies and things in a little bit, but I'll give you a great sort of dramatic example of this. Masters and Johnson did research on the human sexual response cycle, and they were literally studying how the penis responds to arousal and how the vagina responds to arousal. So they developed these tools to measure these things. My later slides will have these names written down, but for studying how the penis responds, they had something called a penile strain gauge that they would actually put on the penis I shouldn't say would. I think they still use this technique. They put it around the penis, and it's sort of like a rubber band, but it's filled with mercury, and then it has a cable that goes to a computer. And if blood flow starts to enter the penis, during arousal, then the mercury will detect that change and send the message up to the computer, and so you can tell that erection's occurring. And then for the female, then we have a vaginal plasmidograph that is like the size of a tampon, and it would be inserted inside the vagina, and it had sensors for detecting heat and moisture. I think it picked up heart rate, things like that would be indicators of sexual arousal. And again, it has a cable that's going to the computer to send this information up. Okay, so in the Masters and Johnson research, we're using these quite intrusive ways of measuring sexual arousal. And then also the participants are asked to masturbate for the purposes of the study, right? So that we can see how their bodies respond to, physical stimulation. All right. So how many people are volunteering for this study, right? It was very difficult for them to recruit participants because, we have to tell participants before they engage in the study what's expected of them, right? And so when you tell them what's going to be occurring during the study, a lot of people go, no, I don't care how much you're paying me. I don't care how many extra credit points I'm getting for my psychology class. This is not worth it. What you're left with is the subset of people who are willing to do it. And just to give you a little heads up, a lot of the female participants that Masters and Johnson used were actually prostitutes. And so one of the big complaints about Masters and Johnson's findings is that the women who participated may not have displayed typical female responses to sexual stimulation because they may be displaying the kinds of responses that a person has after having been a prostitute, like having worked, as a sex worker. And that might have affected their arousability or the pattern of their arousal, things like that. And so, because of volunteer bias, because there was possibly something different about the group of people who was willing to do the research from the group of people who wasn't willing to do it, we may have misleading results. That's the basic idea, right? Like there might be something substantively different about the people who volunteered versus the people who refused. So these are huge problems for sex research, right? The fact that it's difficult to get volunteers means that our results may not be as generalizable as they could or should be. So it's a huge problem and a very difficult one to get around. So I changed the name from respondents to participants here for my little outline. We're still talking about the same thing, the people who participated. Another basic issue that I wanted to talk about is reliability. And this is the ability of the research to produce consistent results. It could be across individuals using the same tools, or it could be within the same participants across time. We want to get consistent results. So if I administered a test to you today, a good, reliable test would produce the same score for you in a year, right? If I administered a test to, let's say, this whole class, and then administered it to my next whole class, theoretically, if the tool that I'm using to measure whatever I'm measuring is good and reliable, we should see very consistent results across human sexuality classes and for an individual across time. Okay, this is another potential problem because in psychology, sometimes our scales are measuring qualities that are changeable, right? That either through development, you might actually, as you grow and age and have experiences and things like that, you just naturally would score differently. It could be that our samples are not equal from one testing session to another. So for example, those of you who are in my class right now might be substantively different from the students who take my class next quarter. I can't even begin to guess what that difference would be, but I mean, it's possible that there's sort of what we would call like a context effect or a cohort effect, that might occur that would cause one class to be substantially different from another class. And it doesn't mean anything about the tool that I'm using to measure your attitudes or your behaviors. It's really about the fact that the classes are different from each other. I'll give you a dumb not sexuality example. I had for my master's thesis, I was doing research on sixth graders. So you'll be glad it wasn't about human sexuality, probably. It was about memory. And so I used the same exact tool for all 6 groups of students that I was testing. And I got different outcomes for each of the 6 groups, and I shouldn't have. They should have all scored the same. And I was really perplexed by why they scored so differently. And what I had done was use the intact classroom. So, Mrs. Jones's class versus Mrs. Smith's class or whatever. And I got different outcomes for the different classes. And it wasn't until, I did a little sleuthing work at the elementary school that I found out that the students had been placed in their classes based on reading level. And I was like, oh, yeah, those groups were not equivalent to start with. And I did not know that, right? I did not know that one group could read better than the other. And the memory test that I was doing was recall of a list of words, and they all had to write them down. So you can imagine where reading level might produce a different outcome. Probably should have asked that question before I started the data collection. But when we have unreliable results, when we get different outcomes across individuals, we might have to look at the possibility that those groups of individuals were not equal to start with. But we do have to possibly consider that maybe our measuring device is not a reliable measuring device, that it's highly influenceable by very transitory states. If you've got a cold, you score differently than if you're not suffering from a cold. Right? We don't want a test that's like that. We want a test that's much more robust and able to produce consistent results. Validity is the ability of the test to produce accurate results. Really, a good way to say validity is that it's measuring what it claims to measure. So, if I'm administering a test of memory, I really want to be measuring your memory. I don't want to be measuring your facility with the language or your reading skill, right? I want to be measuring your memory. Right? In human sexuality, we want to make sure that when we administer some kind of scale, that it's actually measuring the trait that we think we're measuring. So that's one of the reasons why on your self-assessment assignments, I'm asking you whether this scale that you just took actually is measuring what it's claiming to measure, or do you think it's a good measure of it? Or do you think some of the items are bad? Or I'm really asking you questions about validity. Now I've got this little image that illustrates the difference between reliability and validity. In the left-hand one, you'll see that the shots were all clustered, so they're reliable. The archer is, pointing the bow and arrow at the exact same spot every time. The problem is they're not hitting the actual target, right? They're over there on the top right. So they need to make some adjustments to maybe become more valid. Now, if you look at the next one over on the right, you see the low validity, low reliability. Now they're not clustering at all. They just sort of have shots everywhere, and they're missing the target, right? So low validity, low reliability. Now I'd like to say they are sort of circling around the target. So that's why it's listed as low validity, low reliability. It's low, it's not no, it's not absent, right? They're kind of hovering around what they're trying to measure. So it's it's not that reliable and it's not that valid. The one that's one more to the right, now you see that all the shots are clustered above the target, but they're all over the place. So they're not even hovering around the actual target. They're sort of off as far as the validity, and they're off as far as the reliability. So we're saying it's neither. It's not reliable or valid. It's not even circling around the target. Now, if you look at the far right, you see that the arrow is actually hitting the bullseye, and all of the other previous shots have clustered right around the bullseye, very close. So for individuals taking our little scale, let's say, some of them, it's more accurate than others, right? It's more reliable. It's more valid than others for different respondents. For one respondent, it's a complete bullseye. For 3 respondents, it's bullseye, not perfect middle, but bullseye. And then for 3 respondents, it's right in the next ring, right? So it's reliable. We're hovering. It's valid. It's more or less valid for each individual. It's reliable because it keeps clustering around being valid, right? So that's the best we can really hope for. In psychology, we're going to see that some scales produce better scores for individuals than for other individuals. Like some people will take the scale and their score will very accurately represent exactly what they think about this thing. And for other respondents, it won't be as good of a measure. And so we have to be aware that, it's never going to be bullseye, 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 bullseye for every single respondent. We have to accept some error in order to overall be accurate. And so we're willing to accept that in psychology, that it's sort of hovering around like on that far right picture. What we would like to avoid is, just sort of never hitting the target like the two middle images are doing. All right. And if I had to pick one of the two, if I only got to be reliable or valid, I would pick valid personally, because I want to be measuring what I'm claiming to measure. And I'm willing to accept the fact that, the person might score differently if it was a different day or if they'd had a different experience prior to this testing. I'm willing to accept that for the individual, but I am not willing to accept the idea that I'm measuring something that I don't mean to be measuring, right? Like I want to be measuring what I'm claiming to measure. So I'd rather take validity than reliability personally. All right, let's go ahead and take a break here and we'll start breaking it down into the different methods that are really popular in human sexuality.